Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 21 of the 5-Year Real Estate Career Podcast. Today, it's just Mr. Skip Wiley and myself. Eric Wilner is flying off to Washington, D.C. for his high school reunion. But never fear, because Skip and Patrick are here. Today is part 2 of our podcast on negotiation strategies for working with first-time home buyers. And part 2 today is post-contract negotiation. So imagine, if you will, starting a real estate career that in 5 short years would enable you to be able to live the lifestyle that you desire with the amount of income that you dreamed of. And folks, this is not hype, this is reality. What we cover each and every week here on the 5-Year Podcast are components to this. And we work with our audience and we work with our team to solve these issues for today. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of things, namely, is a deal dead when something goes south on you, when the inspection or the appraisal comes in not on target? Can you negotiate the transaction after the contract has been signed, sealed, and delivered? Your contract's falling apart. Oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Well, what can you do to save it? We're going to talk about that and some of the most common reasons for renegotiating the transaction. So while we're having a few technical issues with Skip's video camera, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, negotiation strategies, as we know, are a huge topic in our industry, whether it's negotiating commissions today for buyers agents, commissions on listing properties, or negotiating actual transactions. As we know, there are several times that these negotiations occur, transactionally speaking. One that we covered last week, episode 20, was before the contract. And we talked about all kinds of neat stuff with seller concessions, down payment assistance, price strategies, etc. Today, we're going to talk about post-contract negotiations. So the first thing that happens, and Skip, I know you can still hear us, so we're going to talk about this one. In the timeline, you've got yourself a fully executed contract with buyer and seller. And as the timeline goes on, first piece should be deposits, initial and secondary deposits placed, but the inspection comes up. And we all keep our fingers crossed during inspections. Sometimes they don't always go as planned. Skip, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am with you. And camera-wise, I am dead, but I'm alive and kicking in beautiful Pensacola. So I am going to talk to you about the most important first step after the contract is signed, an immediate step, and that's the inspection. And inspections are both very positive for the buyer and both very negative, and for the seller, both positive and negative. So I could give you a dozen examples, but as we speak about inspections, typically it's the first bump, as I refer to it, in the real estate transaction. I recently bought a house here in Pensacola, and I think this story will illustrate it. My wife fell in love with the house that we live in today. I, being a financial guy, wanted to get the best possible deal on that house. And the first step to getting that best deal was to order an inspection. I negotiated a sales price. I felt I paid too much. And when the inspection came in, I was able to begin the negotiation process. And that is a process, because when that inspection came in, I had signed, what is it called? An as-is contract, which most people will tell you that when you buy a house with an as-is contract, you're buying it as is. The seller's not going to make any repairs. But here is what an inspection allows an intelligent buyer to do. When the inspection comes in, the buyer has the right to walk away from that transaction or negotiate with the seller as to the repairs that need to be done to that property to warrant the value of that property to the buyer. So when the repairs came in, they were extensive: air conditioning, flooring, some issues in the property that I would not pay the price I agreed to unless I negotiated the repairs that needed to be done. So I was able to get $15,000 off of the sales price to make items that maybe cost me $5,000. I used the inspection as a tool to walk away from a transaction or to get the work done.
Yep. And so you really hit on a couple of very important features here. One, the as-is contract. I think today. That's more common than it ever has been. And you really defined it perfectly. I won't repeat that. But it does allow both parties a little bit of protection, right? The buyer doesn't get stuck with that lemon that they didn't realize because of undisclosed defects to the property. The seller doesn't have to make the repairs. They can either choose to reduce the price or walk away from the transaction. But I think we find in most cases, everybody wants the deal to work. The other thing that's really important to consider during the inspection process is when the buyer is financing their purchase, there are some repairs that lenders absolutely require. So if it's about safety, habitability, or other elements, particularly in government financing, like roof leaks, et cetera, wood destroying organisms, these are all things that oftentimes must be taken care of. So that's part of our negotiation. And I'll say even equally important today, in today's world, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. In today's world too, in Florida, the age of your roof can sometimes be an issue too. I just recently had a closing and the roof was 23 years old in absolutely perfect condition. And it almost became an issue with respect to getting insurance on the property. So these are all things that astute realtors must be savvy about and coach their buyers accordingly. And again, the underwriters for lenders will often flag files based on how we look to remedy inspection issues. So doing no repairs but reducing the price can be a flag. So that's one strategy. Escrowing repairs, where the seller will leave a certain portion of their proceeds behind until repairs are done, is another strategy. And then in other cases, just not doing repairs at all and proceeding with the transaction if that's possible. Skip, anything else we want to talk about with inspections before we move on to our next piece?
Yeah, you mentioned it, and I want to really target this one statement about insurance. That is the single biggest issue that people are having in the state of Florida today, in particular, getting good insurance rates. And when an inspection is done, the 5-point and the wind mitigation, if it happens to be an older property, that can really kill a real estate transaction, because when the buyer takes that inspection report to his insurance carrier and realizes that because of the condition, some of the issues that were found in the inspection report, his insurance is now going to double over what he had anticipated it to be, it can kill a transaction. So one of the things that I coach every buyer on in advance, once he has signed a contract, is that you can expect things to be different once the inspection is done. We're going to use it as a tool both to negotiate the sales price, to negotiate repairs. You have to coach the buyer in advance of that inspection, because you don't want him to walk away because he is shocked about the items that the eye doesn't see, but the inspector sees.
Yep.
Coaching
Hey,
people in advance.
I'm going to jump off script here for a second, but I was digging through some old computer files from 2008, and I found one of them, which was Insurance 101, a seminar that I did many times for consumers and for real estate professionals. And I'll tell you what, right after Hurricane, I think it was Wilma in 2005, I must have been 150 realtors in a room. And this seminar was so awesome. And I won't get into the details because we are limited for time today, but Skip, it might be something that we'll want to do either for our affinity marketing clients or even the first-time homebuyer audiences that we're marketing to. Insurance is a very hot topic today, and you nailed it, man. I mean, sometimes insurance can be more than your mortgage payment in certain marketplaces. So not something to just let slip through the cracks as a real estate professional.
But it's a great tool for a buyer. Let's talk about a buyer strictly for this conversation. It is an awesome tool for the buyer to renegotiate the deal, to perhaps get a better price due to the occurrence of items that show up in the inspection report that need to be done that the buyer was not knowledgeable about. So it's a great negotiation tool for the buyer.
It is. And to close out in inspections, you mentioned something as well. Sometimes if the buyer says, look, I'll take the burden of doing the repairs myself, I just want a reduction in price. Right. The buyer can do much better than the cost of whatever. If it's rotted fascia that isn't required by the lender, as an example, that might be $1,000 in repairs, but the buyer could negotiate a couple $1,000s off in price. So good stuff. All right. The next potential hiccup, now that we've got inspections out of the way, we're good to go there. We're fixed, is the appraisal. And many, many contracts, even though they're as is, do have contingency. So inspections, typically one of them. Secondly, financing, and whether there's a specific contingency for an appraisal or just the financing contingency, the appraisal will often affect that. It can be very catastrophic if the buyer is buying with a very high loan to value mortgage. In other words, they're using government financing, FHA, or Fannie Mae 97% loan. If the appraisal comes in low, the lender is going to have an issue and will not qualify that loan to close. So that has to be negotiated. If you've got a much lower loan to value, there's a lot more lenience there. As we discussed last week, there's even more room for seller credits. The more money the buyer puts down, the more they can get in seller credits, which seems contrary to logic, but hey, it's the world we live in. So what are some things we can do, Skip, if the appraisal comes in low? Well, first of all, if the appraisal comes in high, is that a problem?
Well, it's not a problem for the buyer. It may be a problem for the seller if the seller finds out about the appraisal. But
Right.
in most cases, the seller does not know what his property appraises for unless the property appraises low. So
Yep.
the first thing, talking about the buyer today,
Mhm.
and as a brand new real estate agent, what happens when the appraisal comes in low? Does the transaction fall apart automatically, or does the buyer go back to the seller and say, look, I want to buy your property. My bank says the property is not worth, you're probably going to change the words a little bit, but you're going to say the appraisal came in low. I'm willing to pay the appraised value, but not the price that I signed the contract for. Negotiation number one.
Yep.
Now, if the buyer happens to be a buyer with very little money in his pocket, that transaction may very well fall through if the seller isn't willing to reduce it to the asking price, to the appraised value.
Yep.
But if there is a lot of equity, as you brought up, a lot of down payment, then it's much easier to negotiate that transaction. The other
Yep.
thing is sellers let's go back a couple of years ago, Patrick. Nobody cared what the appraisal was when the appraisal, in 2021, 2022, people were paying far more than the appraised value of properties just to get it because competition was so keen. So it's a negotiating tool. Appraisal
No,
comes in low, buyer has an opportunity to renegotiate the deal.
so you hit something important. So yeah, people were paying well above list price and above market value and competing marketplace. And one of the challenges that we found back in those days, in fact, every time there's been one of those big spikes, even in the pre-bubble burst in 2004 through 7, kind of like the invasive species in Florida, right? The Burmese pythons are coming in and eating all the little critters and out competing the other apex predators. Well, cash buyers coming in from abroad, from either out of the country or from higher price markets like California or New York, were beating the daylights out of our poor first-time home buyers that were looking to use financing because they could pay above. And that's a challenge. Well, today things have softened down a little bit, but Skip, can a cash buyer still take advantage of an appraisal contingency?
And yeah, of course, the cash buyer should, by the way, have an opportunity to get out of a transaction where their emotions caused them to pay way too much for the property. The wife loved it. The husband is the financial guy, like in my family. And the appraisal contingency would allow me to get out of that offer that I made simply because the property didn't appraise. So that's
Yeah.
a negotiation tool.
And it's funny, not often done, but back in my day, I would often even recommend to home sellers that were crazy on price, especially in markets where not every home sold, where there's a lot of expired listings and you really had to compete as a seller. If sellers were that crazy, and largely because they thought that what they had was the Taj Mahal, and we knew as real estate professionals, the fact that your dog run is carpeted in the backyard and that your shag carpeting from 1974 is still like new doesn't make your house worth more to anybody. I would often recommend, look, let's get an appraisal. If it comes in closer to the price I think your property's worth than what you're saying, then you pay for it. If it comes in closer to your price than my price, I'll gladly pay for that appraisal, and let's get this house sold, subject to listing the property. I'll only pay for it if you list the property with me. And of course, I'm going to pay for it at closing, by the way, not out of my pocket. But great techniques for negotiating deals that will ultimately go to closing.
Patrick, I have to give you one more quick example, because I know
Sure.
this morning our meeting is pressed for time. Here's the great example. Back in the day when FHAs, and they still do, sell foreclosures, many times I would counsel a buyer to bid over the price that FHA wanted, because I realized that once that appraisal came in, 99 out of 100 times, you had to bid over to get it. But when the appraisal came in, FHA almost 100% of the time sold it for the appraised value of that property. So that's an opportunity to use brain power.
Yes.
With a negotiation of an appraisal coming in to make the transaction work.
Very smart. In fact, even in our previous example, then when the cash buyers were king and competing, not a bad strategy. Now, if the listing agent was bright, they might say to the seller, look, that's a high risk move. Let's go ahead and work with the cash buyer. But yeah, Skip, every little thing that we can put into the into their quiver, every arrow that we can use to the advantage of our customers is always great. And sometimes we forget all the little tidbits that we know. All right, so inspection goes through. We've got the appraisal situated. Are there other contingencies that could cause the contract to have to be renegotiated? Well, how about the infamous home to sell contingency? I tell you, the last property I sold and closed, the buyers had a home to sell contingency. And thankfully, having been there and done that many times, I understood what to do. Largely, what is that home to sell looking like? Is it under contract? Is it ready to close? Is it even on the market yet? These are all variables that we need to be aware of when working with our seller, or even the buyer for that matter, with their home to sell, because we don't want the buyer to get their hopes all up if their home isn't even on the market yet. So let's talk through that one briefly, as well as a kick-out clause, right? So Skip, what are some thoughts on those components?
Just 3 days ago, I have a potential listing in Texas, in Bulverde, Texas, which is outside of San Antonio. And the buyer, the listing that I'm about to take, at the last day, it was listed with another agency, and that person brought them a contract with a contingent on the sale of another property. So I called the potential seller that I'm going to represent, and I said, here's what you need to do. Before you even consider this transaction, you need to gather all the details, which you just talked about a minute ago. The details about, is the property on the market? Is it priced competitively? Is it a property that is going to sell within the window that you want to close on your transaction? But what I also counseled her to do, because they want now to eliminate that contingency, is to get a pre-approval letter from the buyer who wants to buy her property, because it's very unlikely that a lender will finance 95% on the property you want to buy in Texas and allow them to keep their property in their home state. So I said, get a pre-approval letter from your potential buyer, so that you really analyze whether or not this elimination of the contingency is going to be good for you. Because if the lender denies them, they're still going to get their money back on their deposit. And that's why I recommended that. Kick-out clauses also. Patrick, you've used kick-out clauses. Why don't you explain what that is?
Yeah, so when the seller, now we're shifting gears over to, let's say we're representing the seller, when they are getting an offer that's acceptable in every other way, except that the buyer has a home to sell, that's risky, because anything could go south on the buyer's home to sell. So enabling the seller to be able to void that transaction if they get another better offer in on that property, gives them a lot of peace of mind, number one, and protects them. And it also puts the burden on that buyer to get rid of that contingency as quickly as possible. Even if they still have a home to sell and they put up a big enough deposit, they can remove that contingency. And then the repercussions to that buyer would be, well, if I don't close in that period of time because of my home to sell, well, I lose my deposit. So those are ways we can protect the seller, but things to consider with the buyer. But the kickout clause simply states if the home to sell contingency is not removed by X date, seller has the option to void this contract with no repercussions. Then what we need to talk about is in any given multiple listing system, can you keep the property active on the market while you've got a home to sell contingency? I know in our area, there's a special condition, which is active contingent, meaning there are contingencies that need to be cleared. However, a lot of real estate agents don't want to go show properties that are under contract and be a backup offer for all of the obvious reasons, right? My buyer really wants to fall in love with a home. They want to know that they're going to go from 0 to 60 in the appropriate amount of time, and they don't want to lose it because there's some underlying condition. So pending, accepting backup offers, active contingent are all statuses in local MLSs that are a little bit of a red flag if I was showing a property to a buyer.
And let me comment on that. I would never take a quality listing and allow a contingency personally. I just think it is a huge risk for the seller of that property, especially if they have a time window for when they have to be somewhere. 9 out of 10 times, I will tell that person to go find another buyer rather than take a contingency contract. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I'm with you, but again, in fact, in this last deal, the offer was so good aside from that piece, and I happen to know the market well enough that the list price at that property, the home to sell property, was going the condition. I, by the way, looked at that house too. I made sure I physically set eyeballs on that property to ensure that, yeah, that's going to sell for sure. Because if it's questionable, I'm with you, Skip. You could lose your client, you could lose the transaction, all because of the let's do an easy deal, which isn't going to be any easier than just getting the right buyer. All right. Other things that can potentially cause a deal to go south: title issues, right? So when the title company starts running title, they may find liens on the property, open permits that need to be settled. These are all things that need to be dealt with well enough in advance that it doesn't kill your closing or push the date back. And dates are another big item of negotiation, right? A seller oftentimes is selling a property and buying another one, and they want to try and structure that deal so that they don't have to store their household goods twice. They don't have to close 2 separate times, that they can do simultaneous. Not always a possibility, but certainly within the constructs of what we try and do for them. And then, of course, and we can talk about this one, Skip, the final walkthrough inspection. So let's hit some of those topics. Clear title.
I would tell you that a lot of new agents, unless they're coached properly, don't do a final inspection. They just assume the property is the same way it was when the buyer. But both of us who've been in the business, and other people on this call who've been in the business, have seen sellers change the refrigerator, a good refrigerator for a bad refrigerator, pull equipment that was supposed to be left with the property, taken with them to their new property. So also moving out, damaging the property significantly. And an inspection is a negotiation tool, because at the closing table, if there is damage to that property, the buyer can make a great attempt to repair the damage that was done to that property through a credit that the seller will give them at a closing table. So it's a negotiation.
And Skip, I told this story when we were prepping for this call, but my doctor for many, many years, I listed his house for sale in Weston, Florida. It was about a $495,000 home. He bought $1 million home, so that was a good month. But anyway, the buyer that was brought by another agent, the agent says the buyer's going to come in and they're going to basically redo the entire house. They're going to remodel it. The house was fine, but it could have used a little bit of updating. Well, when we went for the final walkthrough inspection, my jaw hit the floor. The televisions that were mounted on the wall looked like King Kong grabbed them and ripped them out of the wall. Nobody used a tool to remove the televisions from the brackets. And the buyer's agent and the buyer walked in. They were shocked and like, what the hell is going on? And the seller had said, well, you said you're going to be remodeling the home. And I was like, wow, as long as I've been in this business, I never would have thought in a million years. But that's one of the things, folks, that we need to make sure that we don't skimp on good advice. So home seller, be careful when you're moving stuff out of your house. Don't break anything. Don't remove fixtures that are attached that were part of the sale. Don't replace them with cheaper fixtures. And although we may think that's obvious, we've got to make sure that they know it going in. And by the way, when we're taking that listing, beautiful chandelier, is that staying with the house? Let's
Absolutely.
make a note of that. And if it's not, that should be an exclusion on the listing agreement and noted in the MLS so that there's no margin for errors there.
Yeah, I have one other just very quick comment about timelines. Newer agents, when you write up a sales contract and the inspection is done in 10 days, which is what most contracts are today, if you miss that and you don't get the inspection done until the 14th day, well, you put your buyer at great risk because the seller no longer has to honor that inspection period. And if the inspection comes in afterwards and it's terrible, your buyer has a risk to lose his deposit. And timelines are critically important, and newer agents don't understand that. So it's our job to advise newer agents and existing agents, guys who just get a little lazy at times, that those timelines are critically important to protecting the buyer in the transaction.
Absolutely. And Skip, you nailed it. I mean, I personally would never rely on anybody being on top of their own timeline. So if it's my customer, it's in my calendar for sure. Not only when the contingency date is there, but also 72 hours ahead of time. Inspections, hey, we've got 3 more days. Have you got your inspector out there yet? No. Well, then we better get an extension on that contingency. You've got to be proactive and deal with it ahead of time as opposed to trying to solve it after the fact. Clear title was one of the other things that we talked about. In my 10 years of selling properties in bankruptcy, I had the distinct pleasure of having every property with municipal liens, HOA liens, all kinds of hair on them. And we learned very early on that we needed to take control of that ourselves, not relying on the title companies. And we got very good at negotiating these deals. Even in other states like California, where solar panels would be installed on homes, where there was a uniform construction code lien, a UCC lien, very challenging stuff to deal with. And so depending on where you're practicing real estate, for those of you watching this podcast, get good at that stuff, get to know it, embrace it, because it can be a deal killer and you can be the hero if you know your way around clearing those things. And it's oftentimes amazing how easy it is to negotiate these things out from those standpoints. The municipal liens oftentimes, look, we want to get this house sold. We want to get a new tax base going from the new buyer. This property's been vacant for so long, it's not going to do anybody any good. You get stuff in writing and away you go. Closing dates, the final piece of our puzzle here. Sometimes they need to be extended. Either the buyer's home to sell hasn't sold yet, and that needs to go on, or their mortgage is taking longer than we anticipated, or the buyer or their agent are just not doing what they need to do when they need to do it. These are things that can be negotiated as well, right? And sometimes additional deposits might be requested, but that's important to note. Any comments on those types of things, Skip?
No, I think you covered that well. I just think that the timeline, a lot of people who are new to the business do not properly respect the dates in a sales contract. They think it's just a guesstimate, when in reality, it's a fact that this property has to close on such and such a date. And if it doesn't, the buyer is going to suffer or the seller is going to suffer. So we need to honor those dates. Very important. It's a part of the negotiation process. And we need to be able to rely on the buyer and the seller need to be able to rely and trust that we're going to hold everybody accountable to those days.
Yep. Hey, one of the comments from our peanut gallery was on the final walkthrough and inspection. Make sure to not schedule that too far in advance, right? I mean, we sometimes want to be Johnny on the spot proactive or Joni on the spot proactive. But yeah, we want to make sure that final walkthrough is done after all the stuff has been moved out of the property, when you can see behind big pieces of furniture that were in there, like entertainment centers, if they still have those, and those kind of things. So very good tip as to when we schedule some of those things. So lots of ways we can negotiate and renegotiate contracts before and after the contract. As an astute real estate professional, there's many things that we really need to understand. And sometimes we're too new in the business to learn it all. And the biggest mistake realtors often make when they're new to the business is I want to wait until I know everything before I start doing the job of prospecting for business. And ladies and gentlemen, that is one of the key reasons why 83% of the people are out of the business within the first year. So here with the 5-year real estate career program, as we always mention, we'll work with you. We will help you tee up new customers primarily in this model, in this marketplace, by doing webinars. Those are first-time homebuyer webinars, investor webinars, affinity marketing webinars. And within all of those, there are sub categories. And we're launching our Selling Your Home in Today's Market webinar. We'll have a much sexier title than that. But feel free to reach out to us. If you'd like to join us in our We'll Do It For You program, there's one thing that you have to do, and that's to get in touch with us. And you can text the word discovery, and I don't have the phone number in front of me, so we'll have to go to last week's podcast. Sorry, Eric normally has that information. He's the keeper of the keys for that. But if anything, just reach out to us. You know how to get a hold of us and join us. We're having great success. Agents are getting buyers from their first-time home buyer webinars. And by the way, even if you don't want to work with buyers, that's me. I gladly will refer them to other agents in my local marketplace who I may even want to recruit onto my team. So we've got limited time today, lots of busy stuff going on. We don't have time for a after the meeting chit chat. So we're going to go ahead and stop recording now. I do wish everybody a great weekend. And until next time, keep selling. Adios, everybody.
Bye-bye. Good meeting.